Welcome to the second Yestival event. What a da. So I'm utterly delighted to be emceeing the second Yestival to date. A gobeithio bod chi gyd yn barod am wledd i'r ymennydd. I'm Ellie and I'm so proud to present this feast for our collective brains. Now, before I move on, if you don't speak Welsh, understand Welsh, I advise you to click on the live transcription button below. It's the CC button just below right now. So whenever we do dip into the language of the heavens, it'll be instantly translated for you by Osian. Now, unfortunately, there are no BSL interpreters here today. They're in very, very high demand, it seems, but we will be popping an interpreter onto our videos when we release them at a later date. Felly mae gwyl ia byddwn ni'n gweud ond fe, gwyl ia yn gyfres o sgyrsiau a dadlau ynglyn â chael dyfodol gwell i bobl Cymru, gydag annibyniaeth yn ganolbwynt i'r sgyrsiau wrth gwrs. Yestival is a series of discussions and debates about a better future for the people of Wales with independence at the core of each discussion. Mae San Steffan yn cymryd trywydd gwbl wahanol i Lywodraeth Cymru a gafod I ethol gan y Cymru. Now we know what is possible and necessary for the future, discussions will turn towards how to implement this when Westminster is taking such a radically different direction from the Welsh Government that was voted for by the people of Wales. Wrth ddilyn themau deddf llesiant cenedlaethau'r dyfodol, Welsh Wellbeing Future Generations Act, canolbwyntiodd yr Yestival cyntaf ar gydraddoldeb, ac fe cynhaliwyd yn gyfan gwbl ar-lein oherwydd y pandemig, wrth gwrs. A mi'n cofio pryd ni, oedd hi'n ddydd Goldewi, oedd fi lot o daffodils yn bydy'r lle, ond nawr just blodau fy mhenblwydd sy'n bydy'r lle, so fi'n clywed chi'n canu penblwydd hapus, ond ni. Building on the themes of the Welsh Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, the first Yestival focused on equality and was held entirely online because of the pandemic. I do recall it being about St. David's Day, and I had quite hungover looking daffodils surrounding me. Today I have, well, they're okay, they're my birthday flowers, and I know you're all singing happy birthday very loudly. I can hear you. But today we are kicking off with Yestival, a strong economy for people and planet. Gwyl ia/ia, economi cryf I bobl ar blaned. Newn ni archwilio sut allwn ni adeiladu economi cryf a llyddymu tlodi I daclo'r newid yn hinsawdd a cholled natur hefyd. We will explore how to build a strong economy capable of eliminating poverty and tackling climate change and nature loss. Equally, how addressing these issues will result in a strong economy, as well as delivering more cohesive communities and healthy minds. We believe Wales is big enough, ni'n ddigon mawr, ni'n ddigon cryf. We are strong enough to eliminate poverty and to be a world leader on tackling climate change and nature loss. Yestival is about generating new messages and conversations around independence. This is one of the very reasons I personally joined Yes Cymru. Nes I ymuno ar mudiad oherwydd pethau fel hyn, I fedru deall sut byddwn ni'n gallu wneud annibyniaeth I ddigwydd ac I weithio ni hefyd. So that I could deeply understand the practicalities and feasibility of independence, how we can make it happen, not only happen, but how to make it work. To sharpen my mind's debate while I'm at the pub or at the park, a socially distant party, so I can deliver good knowledge to others who are curious. Cofiwch wrth rhannu eich meddyliau ar-lein I ddefnyddio'r hashnod gwyl ia. Yes, when you do share your thoughts online, use the hashtag Yestival and of course tag Yes Cymru. So we have three fantastic panels for you today. First we have Eliminating Poverty with Ellie Harwood, Hilary Wainwright, Russell Todd and Shavanah Todd. Then there's the climate change, nature loss, Green New Deal, and finally, currency. So before I go on, the logistics, I know logistics are quite boring. But it's very important for you to totally enjoy your experience from the comfort of your homes today. So audio settings, as a webinar attendee, so os ych chi'n just yn gwylio getre, bydd neb yn gallu clywed chi, os ydych chi'n siarad, bydd a panelist methu clywed chi. So nobody can hear you if you are speaking into your computer right at home right now. If you wish to speak to the hosts and panelists, you will need to raise your hand. Again, that button to raise your hand is at the bottom of your screens. And the host will give you necessary permissions. Hefyd, allwch chi ddefnyddio y bottom chat a Q&A button I ofyn cwestiynau. You can use the chat button and Q&A buttons to ask questions. So Q&A button enables you to ask questions to the webinar hosts and panelists. There will be an opportunity at the end of every panel for all of you to ask your questions via the Q&A button. So we will really do our best to answer all of your questions. Felly, tynwch yn rhydd I gallu rhoi meddyliau chi yn y chat box hefyd. The Q&A is just it's just easier for us to track your questions in the Q&A more than the chat. So if at any time you do want to join the debate, please raise your hand, that little button there. Which you can find at the bottom of the meeting screen. And if it's at all possible, we will give you permission to speak. It's really important, hefyd, it's very important to follow our code of conduct. Gwnewch siŵr yn bod ni yn behafio'n hunain a gweud y gwir. Mae angen I bod yn garedig i'n gilydd. We need to be very kind to each other. Just pretend that you're speaking to a good friend in your home and not somebody just over the internet. Let's have a robust yet lovely and respectful debates. We have a big team working in the background, so any unacceptable behaviour will be detected and taken action. So general note, treat everyone here today as if they were your real life friend and it'll be fine. If you do notice any unwanted behaviour, os ych chi'n gweld rhywun yn neud rhywbeth a chi'n poeni, halwch neges breifat I ni. Please send us a private message to our host Yes Cymru account on here. So we value your attendance and we want to make sure this is a welcoming and very safe space for everybody. We have, like I said earlier, the lovely Oshan working with a live transcript for those of you who don't speak as well. So remember, if you haven't heard me say that at the beginning, if you don't speak Welsh, press the live transcript button at the bottom of the screen. It says 2 C's on there as well. Sarah will be hosting the panel on poverty. So Sarah is our interim chair at Yes Cymru. So please help me welcome her. Are you there, Sarah?
Hello, I'm here. Lovely to see you.
Oh, I'm trying to see you as well. How are you?
I'm good. I just want to start with apologising for the rain because I went and bought some garden furniture yesterday and then the skies opened.
Oh, I have to say, Sarah, it's just been a joy for me to get to know you over the last few months. It was the first time I'd worked with you, it was on the last Yestival, and you were a huge part of that organisation, weren't you? Yeah,
it was amazing to see how everyone came together on that, and then to do it all over again now and to get to know each other at the same time has been a blessing, hasn't it?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So you're a feminist campaigner with a focus on ending motherhood penalty. Do you want to just talk to us about your work outside of Yes Cymru?
Yeah, so I was talking to a journalist yesterday about this event actually, and was trying to pan out the things I do, and mostly I'm driven around issues that are to do with inequality and poverty and raising people's voices, people who don't feel that they have a voice. So that's where most of my campaigning comes from, really, and that's also part of my journey to Yes Cymru and to independence. It's, you know, I did a lot of campaigning on some of those different issues with at the Senedd, and I would read reports afterwards and see the list of recommendations, and then always at the bottom the things that could really make a change on things like benefits, on, you know, welfare changes, on employment law changes. It would always be, this is a recommendation we'll pass on to Westminster. And I just think, you know, we're tinkering with things, and if we want to make real change, we have to have the power to do that, because we know in Wales that we want to do better and we want to do different, and so that's how I got here.
And that's what I love. You know, I can't wait to actually meet you in the real life. That would be really great. But that's what I feel like you're so always very patient and calm and so logical, and it's just been a joy to work alongside you in the very short time we've done that since the AGM. So I'm going to ask you now to bring on the rest of the panelists. So I'm going to pop off and leave you to it.
Thank you so much. I'll see you later.
In a bit.
Okay, so joining us on this panel to talk about poverty today, we have Ellie Harwood, who is a campaigner who lobbies Welsh Government and others on poverty-related issues such as access to free school meals. Ellie is an expert on poverty in Wales, and she's going to guide us through the context of how things are in Wales right now. We also have Hilary Wainwright, who is the founding editor of Red Pepper magazine. Hilary is an activist, a researcher and a journalist, and has published books on issues including anti-austerity, the role of workers and the knowledge economy. And she's also a long-time advocate of the participatory economy. We also have Russell Todd. Hi, Russell. And you might know him as the founder of both the Community Development Podcast and Podcast Peldroid. Russell is a community development expert. He works with universities across Wales, and I am particularly looking forward to hearing him speak about how Yes Cymru and how the independence movement can reach and engage disadvantaged communities across Wales. And last but definitely not least, we have Shavanah. In February 2020, Shavanah was appointed as the Acting General Secretary for Wales TUC, and that was before we knew what 2020 was going to bring. Shavanah did an outstanding job highlighting workers' rights and the deep inequality in our society amid the pandemic, and she's now the permanent General Secretary. And also, as my daughter said last week when we saw Shavanah on the news, she said, "Look, Mummy, that's one of our sheroes who could be on a banknote in Wales." So welcome to our panel, and I would like to pass over to Ellie, who is going to speak with us first. I think there are some slides that will be coming over too. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Shemai. I hope everyone's okay. I just need someone to give me permission to share my screen because I haven't got it set up yet. But while we're waiting for that to come on, I'll just say I'm really pleased to be here. I think this is a conversation that we really need to be having, and it's great to have an agenda that allows us to talk about eliminating poverty and living sustainably, because it's really important to address both together. And I'm going to run through a bit about the situation as we are right now in Wales, and perhaps what we might be able to do to sort of make some progress towards eliminating poverty. So here we are. I've got my screen share up now, so bear with me a sec and I'll just find the presentation. Hang on, it's not, sorry. I'll be with you in a sec.
So while you do that, I just wanted to add a big thank you to everyone for joining us today. I think we have a good July day to be doing an online conference given the rain, and yeah, it's good to be opening this conversation. Thank you.
Okay, fab. So my name is Ellie Harwood. I'm co-chair of Wales's Anti-Poverty Coalition. As I mentioned, I do a lot of campaigning around child poverty in particular. I'm going to just start off. I think it's really helpful for us to define actually what poverty is, and we're talking about it in terms of what we would understand it to be from an economics perspective, but also in the way that the government and other civil society organisations measure poverty. So the technical definition is one that's based on a household's income. It's measured at a household level. So that means a group of people who live together as a family, really, under one roof. And poverty is there's a line basically where if a household income is beneath that line, then that household is said to be in poverty. So the line is created by working out what the median income is. That's the middle income. If you took all the households in the UK and divided them in half, the one in the middle would be the median income. And then anyone in poverty is if they have 60% or less of that median. So you can see it illustrated with the graphic on the left there. And what you don't often hear in debates about poverty is actually, well, how much money is that? And that's because different households have different poverty lines. So the poverty line for a home that contains just one adult is different to the poverty line for a household that contains an adult and 2 children, or 2 adults and 2 children. So the poverty line changes depending on the composition of the household. So the figures then on the right are the most up-to-date that we have. Basically, this is what 60% of the median income for this type of household would be. And we measure these figures after housing costs, and that's because the cost of housing varies hugely across the country, and it's the same within Wales as it is across the whole of the UK. So really important to look at the money that families have for living. So this is the money that's left over once you've paid for your home, and this is then the money that you need, what we would call disposable income, but really it's about paying, you know, for most people, this would go all on food, on bills, on transport, on childcare, and so on. So in Wales, 23% of the Welsh population live on incomes below the poverty line, below the UK poverty line. So this is obviously a really significant proportion. It's a very high rate. And as we'll go on to see, it affects certain groups in Welsh society much more than others, but there's no denying that we have a very significant proportion of people in Wales living on low incomes. But poverty isn't just a lack of money, and it's very important to understand that harmful is because that lack of money prevents you from participating in society. It prevents you from being able to eat the type of diet, to carry out the kind of activities, and to have the living conditions, the living standards that are sort of customary or typical, and also approved of in society. So the quote there is from Peter Townsend, and this is a very well used definition of poverty, which understands that it's the lack of money that prevents you from being able to live normally, and often that because you can't meet those normalized living standards, you're therefore stigmatized. And a really good example of this is what we would consider to be an average diet or a desirable diet. So 5 fruit and vegetables a day, good quality protein, and particularly when it comes to feeding children. Now, if you're living in poverty, that kind of diet is unaffordable, to be quite frank. And as a result, you may have to fill up your children using food that's less nutritious, but is much cheaper to acquire, to store and prepare. But you will be judged and shamed for feeding your children that kind of food compared to families who are better off and can afford all the fruit and vegetables they want, and to have the time and the space and kitchen facilities and so on to prepare, you know, sort of nutritious cooked from scratch family meals. So that's kind of one example of how poverty makes it very difficult for you to live in a way that's seen as acceptable in your society. And the second quote there is from Ruth Lister, who has, to my mind, written the best books on poverty and is a real inspiration for me. And she says that poverty has to be understood not just as a disadvantaged and insecure economic condition, but also as a shameful and corrosive social relation. So what happens to people when they're in poverty, and whether that's for a short time or a long time, is that they are sort of viewed as being less than. They can be subject to expectations around their behaviour, you know, the way that they live, the kind of attitudes towards low-income mothers if they have a glass of wine compared to a middle-class mother having a glass of wine, you know, all of these kind of things. The whole of society expects poorer people to behave in different ways to everyone else because they are poor, and this can have very long-term negative consequences, particularly for children who are growing up in poverty. So one of the arguments in terms of talking about poverty and Wales becoming an independent nation is that the poverty line is measured in relation to the UK median income, which is just short of £30,000 a year. And Wales has a lower median income. So if Wales were to become an independent country, our poverty line, because of the way we calculate it, would be lower. So therefore, overnight, we would have fewer people technically in poverty because our poverty line would change, because if we have fewer very high earners in Wales, and as a result, you know, overnight we could just redefine poverty. However, I would caution taking that kind of argument. And that's because it's sometimes more helpful to think about poverty using something called the minimum income standard. So the minimum income standard is based on a research method that asks the wide samples of people in the population, including in Wales, what they think that the average person or family needs to have to buy with their money in order to have an acceptable standard of living. So that is nothing luxurious, nothing frivolous, just the very basics that people think you need in order to be able to live a decent life and to not miss out on things that most people will consider good for you, or, you know, kind of just a decent standard of living, to live with dignity and to be able to participate in society. So the MIS, as it's called, is then added up all of the things that the sort of focus groups agree everyone should be able to have, and it's costed up, and this is carried out every couple of years. The prices are adjusted for inflation, and we have a look then, you know, at whether it is enough that people's incomes meet that MIS. And unfortunately, in Wales, a lot of households, many more households than we technically count as being in poverty, don't meet the minimum income standard. So almost 2/3 of children and nearly half of adults have incomes below the MIS. And this wouldn't go away. This fact would not go away in an independent Wales. We would still have to accept the fact that because of the cost of goods and services and the incomes available to people through work and through benefits, that it's very unlikely that everyone will be enjoying a good standard of living that helps them live with dignity, that helps them, you know, fulfill their potential and keeps them healthy. So you can see some examples of where the MIS sits. This has just been published last week, and there's also a link there, which I'll pop in the chat as well, where you can go and compare your own income and the income of people in your area, and see exactly how the MIS is calculated. But I think this is really important to bring into the debate, because if we're talking about things like UBIs, you know, a UBI of £1,000 a month is not going to be enough to get a lot of people, particularly those with dependents or other costs around childcare, disability and so on, to the minimum income standard, unless they can get income from elsewhere as well. So as I said, you know, we've got to look at the fact that the poverty risk is different for different groups in the population. So these figures are the most up-to-date ones that we have. They run to just as the pandemic was starting. So 31% of children overall, although in some areas obviously the rate is higher and in some areas lower, but important to say that there isn't a single local authority anywhere in Wales with a child poverty rate below 20%. So at least 1 in 5 children, even in our most affluent areas, are living in poverty right now. The rate for the entire population as a whole, all people, young and old, is 23%, slightly lower for working age adults and quite substantially lower for pensioners. And when we look then at what we call poverty risk, so this is the likelihood of a family of that particular type is living in poverty, you can see here, I think, the starkest illustration of how our current economy, our current social security system, you know, fails to adequately support certain types of households and certain individuals, and therefore their poverty risk is higher. And these map quite strongly onto pre-existing inequalities. They correlate strongly with issues around ethnicity, gender, disability, and you can see that the poverty risk is so much higher for lone parent households in particular. So almost half of lone parent households in Wales are living in poverty. And very important to note that, with the exception of the pensioners, the majority of people in these households are in work. So again, it's the same with lone parents, more than half are in work. And it's just, you know, that they're held back by things like the gender pay gap, they're held back by lower average wages than elsewhere in the UK. They're often having to meet higher living costs. The cost of childcare is extortionate, the cost of transport can be really extortionate as well. So, you know, I do a lot of work on child poverty, and I mean, one thing the poverty data really shows us is that poverty is really, really concentrated in families with young children. So we have a set of welfare policies from Westminster, but also Welsh Government's own policy as well around, supporting families. And in a lot of countries, in fact, in almost all advanced economies, it's completely normal for the government to support households with the costs of raising children, because children are lovely, but they're incredibly expensive. So the Child Poverty Action Group produce a minimum income standard for children every year, looking at the kind of things that you need to spend money on in order to give your child an acceptable standard of living as they're growing up. And it adds up to a lot. So in most countries, you have things like child benefit. In America, Joe Biden's just introduced a child tax credit. In Scotland, they have a Scottish child payment that goes to households and it helps them with those children. And also in many advanced economies, childcare is heavily subsidised or free. In Wales, that isn't the case. So you can see that the risk of poverty is particularly concentrated amongst families with young children, and particularly concentrated in households where they have more than 2 children. So I'm not going to go into kind of all the solutions, because we've got an amazing panel who are going to talk about lots of the things that might need to change. And I think all through the day, we'll be able to come back and think about these things. But the typical ways that you can address poverty would be to raise people's incomes. So that's one way. You can use cash transfers or social security, but also you can look at reducing the costs. So thinking about that minimum income standard, to what extent could the state itself provide for free or subsidise the cost of many of the essentials of life? And we can also then look at redistributing income. So you can change the proportion of people who are living on very low incomes by sharing out money more equally. And there is a fourth, and I didn't include it because I think we'll be discussing that quite a lot, and that is a standard kind of economic answer to poverty is growth. So grow your GDP, the idea that like a rising tide of wealth raises all the boats and that some might trickle down. Now, we haven't necessarily seen that. It's very controversial, and I'll come on really to show perhaps why that might not be the strategy that we need in Wales going forward. But it's worth noting in talking about a future economy, and what the liabilities of an independent Welsh Government might be, that the current cost of social protection spending, call it that, at the moment, is that the majority of money that goes into benefits, if you like, or cash transfers to households to prevent poverty is in the form of pensions. And this bill is just going to go up and up and up because we have an ageing population. It's inward migration to some extent in some areas, but it's honestly just, there's a lot of people near retirement age living in Wales right now. We also have a low birth rate, and we have much fewer, relatively much fewer people working and paying tax to support all of these older people. So as well as their, social care needs, health needs, they do have very large pension needs as well. We spend quite a lot on working age social security, including providing support for housing costs. And we have many more families, as I say, who are in work, but their wages aren't enough to live off to meet the cost of living. Cost of living is very high relative to what people can earn. And we also have quite a large disability benefit bill. We have very high levels of ill health in some areas of the country as well. And that will go up as well as the population ages and more people become disabled through their life course. So the final thing, and I will stop there, is just that this is something that's called the donut. So it's a piece of work that I did with the Anti-Poverty Coalition, and we will be continuing to do work in partnership with a quite wide range of organisations, including Wales Environment Link. But the donut is a way of conceptualising how you can address both climate change and sustainability and poverty and social inequality in a single model. So essentially it's a way of measuring, what you, as a whole society and a whole economy, what are you doing? How are you faring in all of these domains? And we produced one for Wales. And if anyone would, like to see what it looks like, it wasn't the best result. So essentially, the donut told us that in almost all domains, in fact, all of the domains for the social floor, that is the minimum standard of living that we really want everyone to be able to have, we're not doing well at all. And then on the outer rim, these are the environmental limits. So it's showing kind of Wales's share, if you like, of emissions, things like air quality, diversity loss. We're really not doing very well there either. Twin challenge that we have of ensuring that everyone can have a minimum standard of living whilst living within our limits. And more than anything, I think this shows that at the moment, many people in Wales are over consuming, and our systems absolutely are exceeding the acceptable boundaries of how we should be consuming resources and the emissions we're making. But that growth isn't then translating, or that activity isn't translating into economic well-being for much of the population. So we need to have a really big think about how we can make sure that all of us move into that safe and just space for humanity, really, where we can coexist with everyone having everything they need without excessively damaging the planet that we're living on. So I am going to stop there. Thank you so much, and I'll hand back to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Ellie. That was really, really amazing. Just a reminder to everybody, if you've got any questions, drop them in the Q&A, and we'll be coming to questions at the end of the 4 presentations. I also wanted to raise a quick hello to Sean, who I've noticed is here. Hi, Sean Jobbins. A big round of applause for him, because I don't know whether anyone will have seen him recently. So that's really good to have you here, Sean. A couple of things I just wanted to comment on from what you've said, Ellie, is I was having a chat with my mum about this last night, because I was raised by my mum as a single parent, and of course, you know, we were living in poverty because it's very difficult to work and to raise young children all at the same time. And there were little things. So she said, you know, did you notice? Because as a parent, you try to hide that from your children so they're not impacted by some of those things. And I said it was something very little of, I always knew that, you know, you only had orange squash. You couldn't ask for having Ribena like other kids had. And how that then plays out in your long-term life, because you end up with limiting beliefs on what you think you can do if you constantly know you can't ask for things, or you can't do something like, you know, dreading your period because you know the extra cost that is to your family. And I think there are a couple of other things that you raised, like the redistribution of income and talking about the donut, and that connects to a podcast that Sean did recently with Calvin Jones. And there was something in that really made me think differently about, you know, we have to make tough decisions, and we all have to consume less. You know, we have to think about, do we want that holiday, that weekend overseas, or do we want to make sure that everyone in Wales has that minimum standard of living? And I think we all have to start thinking about that. So before we do go into further conversation, I would like to introduce Hilary, and Hilary, if you would like to speak. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, it's really wonderful to be here, and I just think the title and theme of this conference is so important. This idea of a strong economy for people and for the planet. And why I just think that's so important is because it points to the idea of understanding the economy as a whole. So not just redistribution, but also production. And I want to talk particularly about production and power. I think also it points to the kind of conditions of the economy, i.e. the environment and labour, the people, that is often, you know, taken for granted, and many classic economic models, in a way, abstract from those conditions. And those economic models have guided our economic policy making. And so I think this is a really good framework. I mean, my own sort of experience that I'll pull in or draw from is, I was at first thinking it's not relevant, but then I thought actually in the context of independence and the politics of economics, if you like, and the importance of economics as a form of control and potentially a form of democratic control. My experience with the Greater London Council before it was abolished by Mrs. Thatcher is relevant, because in a way we face the reverse of what you're fighting for. You're fighting for independence and political autonomy. We actually faced a context where we had experience of, I mean, obviously London isn't independent, but we had considerable resources. We have the resources of a nation, in fact, at the GLC, the income of equivalent to many small nations. And we had a significant degree of autonomy. We had, for example, a piece of legislation that we made maximum use of that I think originated, historically during some plague or pandemic, interestingly, which was a piece of legislation which said that you can do whatever is in the interests of all or some of the people of London. So we used that to create an investment board, to create the popular planning unit, which is what I coordinated, which was to do with encouraging and supporting popular democracy as part of the economy. And in a way, the abolition of the Greater London Council and of the Government of London, effectively, meant that we were faced with the significance of not having those forms of autonomy. So I thought maybe in my sort of 10 minutes, and I'll try and be brief, and Sarah, just cut me off or just indicate, that I must wind up. Because I can sort of go on about this. I can draw on some of the things we did, both using that autonomy and political clout that we had, and trying to strengthen it in terms of a partnership between government, in our case, London government, and strengthening the civic economy. So firstly, I'd like to stress the importance of production. So although I think what Ellie said, well, firstly, I want to start by really both congratulating and praising Ellie's sort of overall picture, which is both very shocking and also very significant in terms of thinking about what's got to be done. It's got to be pretty dramatic to achieve that sort of donut effect. And I would argue that it needs action at the level of production and power, because ultimately, in a way, the redistribution model, which obviously is important in some respects, but it's traditionally based on the idea that government redistributes the wealth produced by the market, by private capital. And so in a way, it takes for granted the relations of production and simply redistributes the surplus through that it gains through taxation and so on. And I would argue that if one continues with that model, it's clear that in the end doesn't address the relations of power in production, which actually is what produces much of the inequality of our society. It was significant that during the 80s, when the impact of Thatcher's destruction of the trade unions began to have an effect, inequality, measures of inequality went up across the UK because, inequality and poverty was partly dependent on whether or not the unions were able to fight for the redistribution of resources in production itself. And so I think the issue of a democratic form of production, relations of power in production that are egalitarian, is crucial to eliminating inequality. I mean, it's also interesting that in Germany, where they have a system called co-determination, which personally I think is very weak, but even with that, levels of inequality are less than in a country like Britain, where corporate power sort of runs riot. And in a sense, that issue of power is crucial. And so intervention is in production by the government. But also, I think here it's important to recognize that action can be taken in the here and now, both by local government, which I'll just say something about, and then also by civil society, by civic action. I mean, I think even not even in, but in Wales, there are many examples. I mean, I heard recently about Skyline in the Brecon Beacons, which enables communities to gain full ownership of land. It has a grant, I think, from the Economic Challenge Fund for the future, We can hear more about that later. But so civic action to achieve control over land, to achieve control over the production of wealth is important, but it ultimately needs government action. Now, local government is an important part of that, although obviously local government's been decimated. But there are examples of where local government has used what limited powers it has, for example, the powers of procurement, to shift the relations of power in production in favour of higher wages and therefore some move towards elimination of poverty. So probably people are familiar with what's called the Preston model, where the council noticed that it was increasingly dependent on incoming investment from a very financially unstable global economy, and tried to do something to make the economy both more self-sustaining, more democratic, and more egalitarian in terms of wages. So it used not only its own procurement powers, but brought together all the public sector bodies in the area, hospitals, police, universities, and using their pooled resources, attempted to support local cooperatives, local businesses, on the basis of funds being available and support being available only if wages were raised and training was increased. So there are powers there that actually intervene in production. I think that the question of civil society, I think, is important, or if you like, popular forces, I don't know how to put it, but people power, if you like, it is crucial in this, and it's crucial in relation to the environment and the transition to a low carbon economy, because it's really to do with the knowledge which exists amongst working class people, amongst the people on whom the economy depends. And that's not only in the workplace and in production, but also in the home and the whole sphere of domestic labour. So at the Greater London Council, we had a whole part of our industrial strategy which was supporting the domestic economy, supporting childcare and so on. But this question of knowledge is crucial, because it means that empowering the workers and the workplace trade unions is not just about wages, but it's also about capacity to control what's produced. So, for example, at the moment, there are groups of workers, for example, in Rolls-Royce, facing redundancy because of the collapse of the aerospace industry. Well, not collapse, but certainly diminishing of the aerospace industry, partly as a result of the pandemic, but also desirable because of the threat of climate change. And those workers already pooling their practical knowledge, what could be called tacit knowledge, things people know through what they do, through their designing, through their engineering, to actually develop alternatives that are environmentally sustainable and involve much lower carbon emissions. And I think any strategy of transition towards a low carbon economy has got to involve a relationship between government or public bodies and workers that have that knowledge that government never has. So I think the conclusion, because I think I must wind up now, is that actually addressing poverty requires action, requires control of the economy, redistribution, yes, but not just redistribution, a democratization of production, and that can only be done through a decentralization of the economy, but also through the independence of the different nations and I'd say also cities. I mean, obviously they're not necessarily independent, but they need real autonomy and resources, investment resources, to support the initiatives and the power of working people. So I'll stop there. I hope I've been within my limits. But I look forward to questions and comments and disagreements.
Thank you so much, Hilary. That was really, really powerful. and I think I wrote down a note on one of the last things you said about autonomy, and I think that is a big conversation that lots of us have joined this movement for, is because we want autonomy to be able to make the decisions and make those changes that people want. When you said about supporting the domestic economy, unpaid care is a huge thing in Wales. We have a lot of disabled people, we've got an older population, but how are we valuing the people who provide that care, and how are we making sure that they can live? When you look at the uplift of the extra £20 of those people who live on universal credit, that's being rolled back at Westminster level, and in Wales people voted for a Labour government, so how can they make that change when that's something that they would want, but they don't have the money to be able to do it? Yeah, I think there will be questions coming through, but like I said, we'll come to questions at the end. So I'd like to pass over to Russell, and then we'll come back to you with questions. Thank you, Hilary.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Good morning. I'll just share my screen. I'll fly through this. Hopefully people can see that. Something called the Rogers curve. My background is community development, community work, primarily, well, almost exclusively in the communities that are made up of the people, frankly, that Ellie was providing a statistical profile of. And I think what's interesting about the Rogers curve is that it is scalar. It will work at a population level, and it has a great deal of credence at a more localized community level. So people who are involved in local things, friends of the local park and that kind of thing, reaching out, wanting to engage with people, this hopefully will have some influence and some bearing on them as well. And apologies for a bored 13-year-old who's been sort of wandering around and just got out of bed. His mum's away for the weekend. Let me just, okay. So Rogers curve was developed at Iowa State University in 1957. It's been around a long time by these three gentlemen. Originally applied to agriculture in a very farming context. Rogers sort of took it further, hence he gets the credit with a name. In his book Diffusion of Innovations, about later applications of new ideas and technologies and their take up on a broader societal level, so beyond agriculture and farming. And I put out a short thread on Twitter, as I'm prone to do from time to time, motivated by a particular tweet. I'm not going to say who it was, but we've seen any number of these sorts of references. And I think one of the biggest impacts of the pandemic on the movement more broadly has been the lack of more authentic interaction and debate, and the whole kind of sort of echo chamber of Twitter. I don't think has done it a great deal of good over the last few months, and hopefully we can get back to debating things more in person. But this notion that Wales looks, this was the final paragraph of this tweet, what Wales looks like post-India is for all people to decide only then. And it strikes me as a very impractical, quite naive perspective to take. And I think there's a question that's been posted in the chat already in relation to, how do we appeal to the people living in poverty to get on board and to help with some of the heavy lifting of persuading others, if we're not going to give them any sort of sense of what the future looks like. And on that basis, I'm kind of minded to draw on the great late Raymond Williams, who was born in Pandy 100 years ago next month. His centenary of his birth starts next month, and as an aside is worth getting involved in if people are interested in Williams. To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. This position to me doesn't feel like it's hopeful. It doesn't suggest to me that there is something to look forward to. It's trust us. It's well, we can cross that bridge when we come to it. And I think we've seen the scale of the problem thanks to Ellie's rather sobering presentation. And how many times do we have to keep hearing these statistics? That the future feels quite far away for people living in poverty and the people who are affected by it. And I think the point around the corrosive nature of it of poverty as a social relation, I think is really, really powerful. Poverty isn't something that just happens to other people. It has an impact on other aspects and elements of society. So I put something out where I sort of rather flippantly, I'll hold my hands up, equated that notion of deciding in the future what to do with independence as going to the airport and then deciding where to go on holiday. It seems to me to be just impractical, rather naive, almost a little bit anti-intellectual as well. I think there's a danger that it feels like it's running away from some of the harder debates, discussions, and truths that need to be had and revealed. So the Rogers curve essentially talks about 5 stages, and I'm going to fly through these. I'm more than happy to maybe spend a bit more time another occasion with this. Innovators, early adopters, early majority, late adopters, and laggards, and I'll make links with these back to some of the earlier presentations where possible. If this feels a bit abstract in terms of language, if it feels a little bit jargony, consider this. That in any number of behavioural studies and also of studies of people in actual incidents involving in planes, where behavioural scientists have filled up a plane, it's on the tarmac with smoke, across, and it's very consistent the number of times this has happened, and also across countries, nationalities, cultures, languages, etc. It straddles all of those differences. There's a very, very consistent course of action taken by the passengers. 15% of people will act. They will act logically, they will act with a clarity of thought, and they will focus on saving themselves and maybe others and getting off that plane. 15%, 15% will panic. They will do things that perhaps aren't particularly constructive for themselves or indeed for other people, and could even be considered obstructive for helping people get off the plane. 70% sit there and do nothing. Someone eventually will take their lead from either the panickers or the actors, but 70% of people consistently in these behavioural studies and scenarios don't do much at all. So maybe that's a bit more of an easier concept to consider. So this is the curve. Don't worry too much about the words at the bottom. It's the titles and it's the percentages that are more important here. So as I said, I'm going to fly through these. So innovators form a very, very small percentage of an overall population. And so one thing to say is this, I'm not applying this to the Yes Cymru membership for reasons that will become very clear. This is more around general populations, the wider the populace. So innovators are risk takers. They may feel they have nothing to lose or they have lots to lose, but who cares? They are educated to a high degree and they're very entrepreneurial. But in a political context, they form a fringe. They hang out in small groups, esoteric groups, discussing theories, philosophers, things like that. Maybe they hang out on these sorts of things on a Saturday morning online. I don't know, you can decide for yourselves. But these political innovators aren't your average members of a community or a population. They're not watching the latest TV series, reading the mainstream books and magazines, etc. They may even go out of their way to avoid those. They are disruptors, in a positive sense, though some people might view it as negative disruption. Very, very small, tiny percentage of a market, of a population. Early adopters, also risk takers, also educated, but much more leadership orientated. And this is a really key point than the innovators. If innovators try to lead, or when they lead, they have a tendency to confuse, to confound, to alienate, maybe make people feel a bit stupid. Very, very generally speaking, they're not necessarily people. Whereas the early adopters are. They are outgoing, they're popular, they're connected within their own communities. They are the organisers, the messengers, the doers. They are informed, they seek to be informed, they are confident in debate. They're confident as well in their beliefs. They're also confident, and this is another really, really key point in relation to making this movement, making these messages appeal to a broader populace, including those experiencing poverty. Early adopters tend to be very confident in core messages, a handful of them. When innovators nurture mature ideas, early adopters are the ones that push it out of the nest, as it were. Now, Yes Cymru clearly has some of these on board. There are probably several early adopters here today. But in a population of 3 million, well, there's probably others out there that haven't got on board yet. So where we are on this curve, people will have their own view. The reality is, though, that we probably have more of these people still to get on board, still to find a role, still to invest some time and resource in. The early majority, less risk-taking, tend to be more conventional with their beliefs and their willingness to take on and accept new ideas. I have a worry that many of these people will have been put off in the last 12 to 18 months with some of the stuff they've seen on social media, and that's a concern. But these people really are worth fighting for. They give us a sniff of white line fever, if you like, in terms of the mathematics related to securing referenda, winning referenda, and so on. These people need to be won over. They do an awful lot of heavy lifting for the movement. They're active in their community, workplace socials, donate to charity, they fundraise, they volunteer, they sit on committees, they run fairs, fetes, all of those sorts of things. They're knowledgeable about social trends. And what is critical is that they have influence over their own neighbours, their own micro networks, their hyperlocal localities, which in the course of the pandemic, people have probably been confined to much more than they usually are. So they have a particular value, I suppose, at the moment and sort of going forward as well in the short term. These people, though, tend to be pragmatists. They adopt things, innovations, ideas, when they feel comfortable with them. These people win over the ones and twos, like I said, really, really important. They're not afraid of change, but they don't necessarily go after it. They wait for change to come to them. Now, consider what we've been talking about with respect to poverty and what we've been hearing. It's deeply entrenched in many Welsh communities. And I'm not saying for one moment, but let's be clear, that innovators cannot come from, and early adopters cannot come from disadvantaged communities, absolutely far from it. But it is reasonable to assume that with the poverty figures such as they were, and I think it was 700,000 that Ellie talked about living in poverty, a large number of those will form early and or late majority segments in the broader population. So go back to that tweet around, okay, let's decide what the future looks like only once we've secured that future, that independence, and that state of it. It's akin to asking people to jump over the wall without telling them what's going to be on the other side. Now, for those people that have the cultural, the social capital, financial reserves to be able to deal with the consequences of that, that's fine. But clearly, from what you have seen, people living in poverty have far, far more, proportionately speaking, if you like, to lose from taking those massive leaps of faith. So the late majority, usually much more traditional, usually a little bit more conservative with a small c, usually a little bit less educated, less socially active, maybe a little bit older. Change isn't fun for these people. And unlike the early majority, who let change maybe come to them, late majority people will try to evade it. They will try to hide from it. They will only push back when it begins to really kind of impose and threaten them and challenge a particular worldview. And so think back to those core messages that many of us as early adopters are quite confident in deploying and talking about. They won't work on the late majority. If they did, they wouldn't be in the late majority. They would be in the early majority. They'd be other early adopters like us. So we have to have more nuance in the message. And I'll come back to that in a bit. Laggards, won't spend too much time on these. They tend to be the most traditional. These people, rather than avoid change, will actively fight it, however. And that's what they are worth spending a little bit of time on. They will perceive as having a lot to lose. But these people are not remote, isolated and disconnected. They are connected in their community, though not necessarily in a way that encourages the sort of the transmission of ideas and innovation, but they have huge reservoirs, deep reservoirs of what's called bonding social capital to draw on, i.e. they mix among and have links with people like them, which mutually reinforces their worldview. Just consider these people's views on things like bilingual signs in Wales, an argument that was more or less 150 years ago, but it's still irksome to some. It might be gay marriage. It might simply be just different COVID rules around masks between Wales and England. You presumably get the picture as to who these people are. There's very unlikely to be any laggards here today, but they are worth considering for two main reasons. They aren't worth the fight in a great majority of cases and instances. They sap energy, they sap effort, they sap time that is better spent on appealing to people in the early majority and to a certain extent the late majority. They also, this is more of a personal view, they also sap the fun out of the movement. Cast your mind back to the marches and how enjoyable they were, how much fun they were. We need to find the fun with this. They can be quite a joyless experience engaging with these people, but they can be resourceful, wealthy and connected. And while the innovators and the early adopters are, by necessity, courting the early majority, the laggards are extremely motivated in targeting the late majority. They are the buffer, if you like, for the laggards. They will deploy disinformation, scare tactics, the old tropes and cliches, too small, too poor, language Nazis, you name it. We all know them. They're well worn. They work, and that's why they keep deploying them. The key thing to remember when considering and applying the Rogers curve to our lived experience is that they aren't being deployed at us. Those of us who are on the left-hand side of this curve, whether we're at the far left of it or not is irrelevant. They're not deployed at us. They are being deployed at the late majority. So what to do? The early adopters, so I think one of the key thing is that to recognise that all progressive social movements, civil rights movements, within the environmental movements, people are always lost along the way. People who were on board early always drift away. It's always happened, and it always will. It always happens in progressive social movements that schisms occur. Why do we assume that Yes Cymru and the independence movement will be any different? And some of them won't go quietly. So we need to take that on the chin. It is a necessary step on the evolution of these movements. We need to be more nuanced in our messages. Take, for instance, the Six Nations and how popular the Welsh rugby team is through, was it February, March, April time, and the criticism of 80-minute patriots. Probably these people form the late majority. They need to be persuaded demonstrably of the benefits of change by patronising them and belittling them, particularly patronising something that they are particularly keenly interested in, will not work. So we need to be more nuanced in our messages. I'm not for a moment saying that Yes Cymru does that, but there's plenty of people probably within the membership who tend to get involved in that sort of baiting, if you like. The other thing to bear in mind is that poverty is exhausting. The lived experience of it is exhausting, and there's been some comments to that effect in relation to not having the time to cook meals, for example. And again, it comes back to the point that Ellie was making in the Lister quote around poverty, the shameful corrosiveness that it has in terms of social relations. What the middle class folk, no matter how well intended and do-gooding and everything else that we have to recognise that poor communities aren't, and this still retains this. Even people I know who very left-intended, left-minded, nevertheless fall into some of the old tropes that poor communities and the people that live in poor communities are a bit feckless, they're permissive communities, they're apathetic, lazy, etc. Poverty is exhausting. What these communities do have, and this is where we talk in community development being more asset-based, is to recognise very fundamentally that disadvantaged communities have a rich, tightly woven community fabric of trusted networks of organisations. So in terms of winning these people over in very, very short short terms to the cause, and to help with some of the heavy lifting, and to provide mechanisms and means of communicating and reaching other people in these communities, we have to work through these trusted networks that are in these communities. We cannot merely parachute in and then parachute out. We have to work through them, and we need to build alliances with them in the real world. And it's not just on social media, which probably is stating the obvious, but I think the way things have tended to be confined to social media in the last few months, for obvious reasons, I suppose, I think it's a point that's worth bearing out. And so, yeah, like I said, the sense that poverty is exhausting, and my final point is this: why would we be so arrogant? And I'm playing devil's advocate only to a small extent. Why would we be so arrogant to think that people in disadvantaged communities, that people living with poverty day in, day out, have the time and the focus to listen to us at the times that tends to suit us, that we take the messages to them, when it's such a grind all of the time, living in poverty, and a little bit more humility is required amongst us, the early adopters, those people who are taking out, the ones pushing the message out of the nest, and all the other terms and metaphors I've used. When we reach these people, is there to be a little bit more humility in it, irrespective of the statistics, is to be a little bit more nuanced and aware of what the lived experience is like. I've glossed over the intersectionality around communities of interest, communities of shared characteristics, communities of place. Now's not the time to go into that in any great detail, though I'm acutely aware of it all. But that's me done. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch, thank you so much, Russell. There's something that I wanted to note, actually, and it was something I was talking to Ellie about a few days ago when we were working on something else together, and it was noting the difference between poverty and economic hardship. That the latter is an exceptional state that someone might experience. So an example I gave was people who were applying for universal credit for the first time during lockdown, but they knew that they had the skills and the networks, that was a temporary state, that they'd go back to work when the world opened up again. And poverty, on the other hand, is an economic state that requires long-term structural change to be freed from. And it really brought me back to what you were saying around people being able to take that leap of faith. Poverty is entrenched in our communities, and if you're living in poverty, then you don't have the savings to be able to take that leap of faith. You don't have that buffer. So we have to provide the answers, and we have to work out the answers through these conversations of how we know that an independent Wales is going to be a better Wales for everybody. I really agree with you around nuanced messaging and about how lived experience of poverty is so exhausting. And I think one thing that we can really do well, if we can get out across the summer and talk to people in Wales and come away from that echo chamber of social media, is to talk to people through those trusted networks. So that's something that I think we could do with our membership and with our groups across the membership. It was really interesting as well that a couple of points came up around the petition that we put out about the flag that the Westminster Government want to put outside of one of the buildings in Cardiff city centre. And someone made a comment that, why do Westminster want to spend £18,000 on a Union Jack when there are so many people in Wales who are reliant on food banks? And we've got 20,000 signatures on that petition. If each of those people, could give a small amount of money, then we could actually counterbalance that 18k on a Union Jack and spend it on the people in Wales who need it. And it is again about coming back to those difficult questions of, there's been a few comments that have come up around how do we afford it, and that's part of the conversation that we want to have today. But do we need to look at that redistribution of income? Do we need to do those things where we ensure that everybody in Wales has that standard of living that we were coming back to earlier? It's really, really great to have you here. And I know that this is just the start of a conversation of making sure that not only getting out to our 18,000 members, but also getting out to those people, like you say, who are on that curve that we can bring on board and kind of work with to build the Wales that we want to live in. So again, just a shout out that we will have Q&A coming up, but I'd like to now pass over to Shavanah, who will be speaking before we go into that Q&A. Thanks, Russell.
Thanks, Sarah. Bore diapa, good morning, everyone. I'm Shavanah, I'm the General Secretary of the Wales TUC. We represent 48 affiliated trade unions in all parts of the economy and public services. We organise all different types of workers to come together as a democratic collective voice. So if you're not actually yet a member of a union, you can find a union finder tool on our website at walestuc.org.uk to find out which union actually fits best for you. So as a Welsh union movement, we have taken the decision to work in social partnership with Welsh Government as the best way to deliver the sorts of changes that all workers need to see. So this means trying to find solutions in partnership with employers and government. And it doesn't mean only working on those areas of agreement, but it does mean taking a far less combative approach compared to how many people choose to caricature unions. So social partnership is actually a choice by all sides. And for us, it's about what actually delivers for workers. So if at any stage our union movement decides it's no longer delivering or serving this purpose, we won't continue to work in that way, because we have way too much responsibility to be dogmatic, and social partnership is not the Welsh way if it doesn't actually genuinely deliver for workers. And that brings me really nicely to what our movement is actually about and what the Wales TUC is. So at its core, the Wales TUC seeks to improve the economic and social conditions of workers in Wales, regardless of whether or not you're in a job. This doesn't just equate to eliminating poverty. It means that every single person, regardless of who you are or where you come from, no matter how you identify, should have the same access to good quality jobs, which reward you well and allow you to enjoy your lives, as well as work safely, securely, and with dignity and respect. So this obviously isn't the case now, because no sector is actually without exploitation, discrimination, and other rights abuses which genuinely do harm people. And the in-work poverty rate has risen so rapidly, illustrating just one group of workers and their families who are being failed by our labour market. And we published research earlier this week, which found that 60,000 children of key workers are actually living in poverty in Wales. So crucially, our approach is actually about recognising that this will not happen if power and wealth is too concentrated in the hands of a few. So it views the workplace as inherently imbalanced. Bosses can and will take unilateral decisions unless workers are well organised. And it's a worker's fundamental right to organise as a collective and to make sure that they have a strong voice. And we want as many workers as possible to realise this right. So we are, unapologetically committed to growing our movement in order to eliminate poverty and discrimination. And key to all of this, as far as we are concerned, is collective bargaining. So when we talk about collective bargaining, it is actually the official process by which trade unions negotiate with employers on behalf of their members. Collective bargaining with a recognised union is the best way to get decent wages, terms and conditions. It also enables workers to negotiate their fair share of the profits of their labour, not just what their boss determines they should have. And it means that the offer is based on what actually works for workers, what they want, whether it's subsidised childcare, flexible work, better hourly pay, safer working conditions, non-discriminatory, unbiased, inclusive work policies, or a just and green transition, where worker voices at the table as employers begin that process of changing the way in which a business functions and operates. So it's actually the very opposite of something like the voluntary living wage campaign, for example, which has narrowly focusing on hourly pay. You simply don't actually address the many, many factors that impact working people and put you at greater risk of poverty now or in your retirement, including access to proper sick pay, a good occupational pension, and the idea that decent work is a right, not a voluntary initiative that the employer opts into. So it's especially important in the UK. Our labour market is defined by a culture of low enforcement. The UK's approach to enforcing rights is laughably weak by international standards, and the capacity has been ripped away by years and budget cuts from the UK government, which was all a part of their austerity agenda, which I'm sure many of you are well versed with. The Health and Safety Executive, for example, has had a 50% funding cut. So we are now, really looking to Welsh Government to do as they said they would in the Labour Party manifesto, which is to seek devolved control of the HSC. So we're looking to see what role we can play as well in seeing that being pursued. We also have a complex system of employment rights in the UK, which makes it really hard for people to even know if they're being exploited, let alone what to do about it. So, for example, we know there are at least 20,000 people in Wales who are being illegally paid below the minimum wage. Yet an employer is likely to get an inspection on this once every 500 years. I mean, what sort of deterrent is that? It's just pretty shocking when you put it that way. So this makes unionisation even more important, including through the difference that collective voice makes in designing and shaping the laws and our policies which affect workers. So we would argue that a decline in unionisation levels and collective bargaining coverage is the major cause of widening inequalities. I'm not sure if there are any slides up. No, okay. I have got a slide in front of me, but I won't talk about it. But it basically demonstrates worker how power is diminished and inequality is widened. But in terms of this also then links back over to our core aims to grow unionisation and collective bargaining coverage to the overall aim of ending poverty. If workers remain as disempowered as they are now, we have no real hope of eradicating poverty, no matter what our constitutional status is. Everyone has a right to a collective voice at work. It's actually a universal labour right. So we shouldn't try and reinvent the wheel all the time by redefining, what good employment looks like. It's workplace democracy. It's balancing out that power of the employer and their workers, which is inherently unequal through collective voice. And one thing that we're really mindful of when we talk about poverty and inequality is we don't just consider the economic harms. Health inequalities are far too real, and the pandemic has been yet another reminder that poverty and health are so interlinked, including at work. So one example is that people who can't do their job, of course, from home are typically lower paid, and almost half aren't entitled to their usual pay if they're off sick. So around half of the people who can't work from home face a real financial hit if they need to self-isolate and do the right thing. And a lack of proper sick pay has literally undermined infection control. And there are far too many examples of the link between income, wealth, poorer health and well-being outcomes. And there is also a growing case now that some forms of insecure work, those defined by precarity, such as forms of agency work, and of course, false self-employment are actually worse for people's health than unemployment. And given the state of our labour market, paid work is no longer a guaranteed route out of poverty, and nor will it necessarily improve your health and your well-being. So, this is the fairly grim context for the Commission that we're putting together as the Wales TUC to consider how devolution should evolve to improve the quality of work in Wales and end poverty, including employment and industrial relations law. It will seek to draw conclusions on how Wales's constitutional arrangements should evolve to better meet the needs of workers. It will also consider how political decisions being made in Westminster, like the upcoming £20 cut to universal credit, which will harm tens of thousands of working families in Wales, many who are key workers, is definitely going to be impacting us here in Wales. And this is yet another example of that levelling down, not the levelling up agenda that we were promised by Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. We need a social security system that helps people get back on their feet, not one that locks them into poverty, and often intergenerational poverty as well. And going back to the Commission, we hope that its findings will actually influence public debate on issues relating to Wales's devolution arrangements and constitution, Welsh Government Standing Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales, and shape a refreshed Wales TUC position as well, which is really important for us to be agreed at our next Congress. But we don't want it to be prescriptive to the point, because the point is to inform debate within our labour movement. It's to put us in a position where we can consider options and identify where the interactions of some of those policy areas are perhaps failing workers. And we have a responsibility to make sure that this debate is as accessible, inclusive, and reflective, actually, of every type of worker as possible. So we want to make sure that the labour movement is well informed to develop their thinking here. And just to end, we're also looking to Scotland as well. We want to work with our trade union family at the STUC on this. They're clearly in a very different place to us, but the idea that future constitutional change should be driven by the principles of working class solidarity and equality. That is what will define and shape our work on this and bring it back to our core purpose, which is to improve the economic and social conditions of workers in Wales. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you so much, Shavanah. I think one of the things that I highlighted whilst you were speaking, there was a note that I had where it said that 1 in 3 Welsh households doesn't have enough money to buy anything beyond everyday items, and that the pandemic has deepened inequality, where 1 in 5 households on incomes of 20,000 or less as a household income have seen a drop in their income, and that 1 in 5 households of an income of 40 plus have seen a rise. And I think the work that you've done is really to highlight how that deepened inequality has happened in the last 18 months. Talking about social partnerships and being less combative, I think it's really important to also note that anyone who watches you work knows that you are never afraid of asking difficult questions from those people that you're working with. And I think that that is something that we can learn from as a movement, because it isn't going to be easy to deliver what we want to deliver. And it's important to ask those difficult questions, because that's the way that we build that partnership and we work together for the constitutional change that everybody wants. collective bargaining, it's really interesting for everyone to have that input from you on how that works, and maybe it's something that we could do together to bring our groups together and talk about the Wales that they want. You know, we all know that people join Yes Cymru because they want to have a referendum, but it is about talking the Wales that we want to live in afterwards. So what I'd like to do now is thank you so much and move on to the questions that we have. So what I'll do, if all of our guests who have spoken on the panel today would like to jump in at any point on these questions, because they haven't been specifically aimed at anyone. So I'll start with the first question from Ruth, who asks, when salaries are raised, companies and public institutions would raise their costs. So how is Wales going to strike that balance?
Shall I go? I mean, I think, you know, there are some questions we can ask in an environmental sense about whether we, you know, we might need to consider reducing consumption of some products, goods and services. There's really, you know, honestly no need for everyone to have a brand new smartphone every 2 years, the way that we just throw away, you know, particularly electronics and other kind of pieces of technology. They're designed to become obsolete. So, you know, we do overconsume as a collective society. But I also think that, you know, there is a case that some services are extraordinarily expensive already, particularly care services, and that the state might have a bigger role in providing those or subsidising the cost of those. So, you know, I think it's getting into quite complicated sort of questions about what kind of economy we want to have, and whether we want to, you know, continue with having an economy that just kind of grows and sees constant inflation, constant rises in both the cost of living and you know, obviously then people's wages as well, but that doesn't always deliver better living standards. The difficulty is that we live in a globalized world, and so much of what will happen to Wales's economy is dependent on particularly what will happen in England. So, you know, I'm probably not the person to talk about that in any great detail, but we've seen when things like the minimum wage has been either introduced or raised, that doesn't necessarily translate into higher costs. It can, obviously, but it's not always the case. And there are things that the state can do to intervene with that.
Thanks, Ellie. Is there anything anyone else would like to add to that, or could we move on to the next question?
Just to add one thing, and that's when you talk about, when it's right that employers will increase costs, but actually one's also got to look at what else comes into price, which is profits and dividends. And I think that a devolved government could and should do more to actually control profits and dividends. You know, put a cap on dividends, or increased taxation of profits. And okay, then people might say, well, then you won't get big private corporations coming to invest in Wales. But surely there's an economic strategy that shouldn't depend on big corporate investment, in which so much of the money leaks out of the Welsh economy and into the hands of shareholders and so on. So I think one shouldn't talk about increases in costs without looking at profits and dividends, and those make up the price as well as the increase in costs.
I think that also links to another question that's come in from Mandy, she's asked how many people in Wales work for Wales-based employers. I don't know if anyone has the answer to that, or if they'd like to make a comment on that question.
It begs, I'm no economist, so I'm not sure I'm well placed to answer some of these, but without wishing to be flippant, which I maybe have a tendency to be sometimes, is define work. I mean, how many people are employed by them? is one question. I think a slightly distinct question is work, and you alluded to the point earlier, Sian, and people like Edgar Khan have talked about this, and the number of women, ethnic minority people who give far too much of their labour away for free or severely undervalued prices, then, for want of a better word. Like I said, I don't mean to sound flippant, but I think this whole concept of work going forward with things like shorter working week, potentially basic income, tends to complicate this sense of, who is working for whom, based where, and so on. But like I said, I'm not the economist, so sorry.
I haven't got that kind of data in front of me. But just building on the point that was just made, as far as social partnership is concerned, the Welsh Government is set to introduce legislation on social partnership, but also on procurement. So as if there is going to be any public money that is going to be going to any type of business that is going to be exploiting workers and deepening that inequality, because the reality is that we saw from the last, recovery, what happened after that. After the last recovery, we just ended up further deepening inequality, and we saw yet more, bad employers and public funding ending up supporting all types of labour exploitation. So I would like for the Welsh Government to tighten that up much more than we currently have, and also to start delivering on the Fair Work agenda, because the Fair Work agenda itself, more broadly, will help us, tackle some of these poor working conditions and move us towards, there's been so much talk about rebuilding the economy, making it more fairer, more inclusive, and, every particular, whichever slogan you buy into. But the reality is that this is about exploitation, and this is about inequality. And as the purpose of the panel discussion today is about eliminating poverty. So I think that there's a range of different things that the government themselves can be doing, and we as citizens of Wales can be demanding more for.
It is exactly that, isn't it? We as citizens need to demand more what we want and have those to be able to get what we want and the change that we want for Wales. Ben Ark has got a question. If you would like to come in, Ben, thank you for...
Not so much a question, but just some food for thought that Welsh Gov could provide tax breaks and investment and banking services for cooperative movements, which very much benefit worker wages or participant wages. As well as that, if you look at any of the modern monetary theory work on things like the job guarantee programme, which creates a public pressure, so public opportunities and jobs, which then compete with private jobs, and that then would push up wages in the private sector. So if anyone's interested in looking at modern monetary theory, job guarantee programme, that's a really nice place to start. And then, as well as encouraging government to create tax breaks and banking opportunities for cooperative movements.
Thanks, Ben. Does anyone want to comment on that? Any of our panellists? Hilary.
Yes, I mean, I agree with Ben, but I'd also add the other ways in which the Welsh Government could support cooperatives. And I think also the importance of the cooperative economy in developing an economy based on self-determination is key and an important part of any genuine independence movement, i.e. economic independence as well as political independence. But I think the other way in which the Welsh Government could support cooperatives and other social enterprises or democratically controlled enterprises or unions fighting for democratic controlled enterprises is by using its procurement powers. I mean, this has already been talked about, but I think, and I'm not, obviously I'm an outsider, but I think it could be well worth, maybe it's already been done, identifying the procurement power of the Welsh Government and of public bodies in Wales that could then be deployed as a key instrument for using existing powers, but using them imaginatively for reorienting the Welsh economy towards local control. So I think that's an important addition to your really valid point.
Thank you, Hilary. I want to come on to a difficult question now, which is coming from Nigel, because we do have to answer some of those difficult ones. And Nigel has asked, has the likely general income tax rate been costed in order to meet our intentions? I think what he's saying in some of the backup to that question is it seems that money is growing on trees. We are part of a national debt in the United Kingdom. So how are we going to have that conversation and do that research of how we afford the Wales that we want to live in?
I'll just say one thing, and that is that we probably will need to pay more tax. This is just me speaking really in a sort of personal assessment. We currently live in a relatively low tax state compared to a lot of other economies. I'm going to pop in the chat now a link to what I think is a really good assessment of Wales's fiscal future. It's written by the Welsh Government Centre at Cardiff University, and it looks at how much money we would be able to raise if we just changed some of the taxation policy. And of course, you know, we tax people on income at the moment, but there are many other ways that you can also raise money. I appreciate this isn't a popular sell. It's not politically popular, but I'm not a politician. And, you know, this is just the bare facts of it, is that if we want to have the kind of socially inclusive, just and high quality standard of life that people in countries like Norway and Finland, Iceland enjoy, people pay more tax, quite considerably more tax, but also they contribute to their own social protection. So social insurance schemes, which our current social security system is only partly what we'll call contributory. So you pay your national insurance, but often when you find, you know, that you need to then make a claim, you know, what you get back in terms of things like job seekers allowance or universal credit is pitiful compared to what you get in a lot of other countries. So there are lots and lots of things, you know, where particularly talking about the role of social security, which is so important for fighting poverty. You can't do it without that. That you can look at how people contribute over the life cycle into systems. So, you know, I'm kind of putting it there, I guess, because it's, you know, something that a lot of people don't really want to talk about. But let's be honest, you know, having good social security does cost money. Now, it doesn't have to come from individual citizens, and you know, you can design tax systems that are highly progressive, and you can tax things like wealth and land as well as income. And you know, there are lots of creative ways that this can be done. But even if all we did was just raise tax rates to the kind of Eurozone median, it would raise a lot of money for Wales. So I'll pop that link into the chat. It's a really good report, and I do recommend, if you're interested in this kind of thing, giving it a read, because it gives quite a good balanced assessment, I think.
Thanks. One thing that we'll do is we'll collect all of those links and we'll send that around to everybody who's registered afterwards, and just in case you don't want to click on them now and kind of take your screen somewhere else. Is there anyone else who'd like to come back on that question on the panel before we move to the next question? Okay. One thing I wanted to bring up whilst you're here, Ellie, because it is a linked question, is something that's coming from Mike, who's asked, how does the Welsh donut compare with other countries?
That's a good question. A lot of countries haven't done a donut, and some have. I mean, I think I know that, for example, so it's been scaled down to city size. So there's one for Amsterdam, and they're using it in their kind of planning the economy for their city and their regional development. I think Wales, certainly compared to the rest of the EU, you know, we have more people below the social floor. So, you know, we don't score well across all of those domains. And particularly, I think in areas like land use, it's not good compared to some other countries, because you know, so much of particularly like where I live in the South Wales valleys, all the mountainsides are just covered in kind of you know, forestry, commercial forestry and so on. But I think, you know, to be honest, most countries, most advanced economies are massively exceeding the outer limits of the donut, and there's not, you know, these kind of solutions to some of those really need to be happening, you know, at a sort of collective global level. We are going to be doing some more work on the donut later on this year, and Kate Rayworth, who was the original author of the concept, is coming to speak in Wales. So that's something that, again, I would say, come to that. She's, you know, really interesting speaker, and it's just a really useful tool for thinking about these boundaries. To be honest, I think when we were kind of talking about it as a coalition, it was hard to develop recommendations, and we're at the very, very beginning of thinking about what public policy might look like that will help us address these things at the same time. And what I can see from my anti-poverty work is that there can be sometimes things that seem like a solution that's, you know, addresses sustainability and tackles poverty, but actually they can be really dreadful and stigmatizing for people in poverty. An example of that is the redistribution of food waste. So trying to prevent, you know, food waste going into landfill, or, you know, having to be put back into composting and things, by feeding it to poor people and seeing that as a solution to poverty. But actually the reason food poverty exists is because people don't have enough money. And when you're already that kind of, you know, disadvantaged in society, being given like literally the scraps from the table, the stuff that the supermarkets couldn't sell, it's really not actually very good for you. It's not sustainable for your livelihood, for your well-being. It doesn't get us to the root cause of the problem, which is that people don't have enough money, and that supermarkets, you know, throw away a third of the food that they produce. You know, so we're not really tackling the bigger systemic issues. So overall, sometimes what we think is, you know, something that can be quite helpful, it's only when, you know, you actually speak to the people who are on the receiving end of it, listening to people in poverty and them saying, you know, this really isn't meeting my needs and it's not helping, that you start thinking up kind of, you know, more other more effective ways. And, you know, again, I think a lot of the things around, you know, how Wales could have a healthier donut, I guess, where we're all living in that safe and just space, is to think about, we've got more than enough and we overconsume, but it's just not shared around effectively. So looking more about redistribution, not just of money, but also resources, and you know, lots of conversations about that in communities, about, you know, how we can go into a kind of circular economy that reuses things, repairs things, collectively owns things, that kind of approach.
Thank you, Ellie. We are running out of time on the Q&A, so I'm going to put up 2 questions and then I'll ask you all to just speak on those 2 questions before we move on. So one question is poverty a feminist issue? That's quite interesting, because until we had Russell on board, we had the unique problem of having a woman-only panel, and wanted to make sure that it was a balanced panel. And the other question that's come in: has the Brexit vote been analysed in terms of the Rogers curve, and are there lessons for what we can or shouldn't do for independence? So I'll leave those 2 questions and then I'll come to an end before we move on.
Shall I take that second one?
Thank you.
It has, and what's interesting is there's different takes on it. Basically, I think what was challenged, it was almost the pace at which people were converted, for want of a better way of putting it, to you know, to a pro-Brexit position, in contrast to a lot of maybe the opinion polls and what people are within maybe political circles expected. What it reinforced, though, of course, is that dreaded sort of middle ground, is that actually you focus your messages on the people that will bring about the essentially the mathematical, very pragmatic mathematical you know, figures that you require, basically, in terms of referendum, 50-50 in, out. Okay, it was very, very simple, and we all have our views as to, you know, how flawed that was or wasn't. In terms of what that would mean on a constitutional basis with respect to independence, you know, it will depend on whatever the referendum terms, however they will be set. But it certainly reinforced the focus on how important, and the point hopefully I've tried to convey, is the early The early majority, so the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, 34%, something like that, do an awful lot of heavy lifting. And it's not because of the numbers and how persuasive they are, it's to do with how connected they are in their community. And that dynamic is really, really important to focus on. And it's almost quite, the opposite end of the spectrum in these debates around some of the fiscal economic things, which I'm not particularly qualified to talk on. But it's that sense that, well, who's going to nurture the debate around some of these issues? Because you can't not have them. They have to be had at some point. It's these people who are popular, extroverts, connected, they're involved in activity local. So the people that take the message out is a key thing. Clearly as well with Brexit, the whole use of social media, Facebook and targeting and all the rest of it, we've heard some of the more sinister elements of that. And, I guess that's almost always a factor as well. And when this curve was first conceived, of course, in the 50s, there was no such thing as internet, etc. But, the mass media is a part of the getting of messages out. So, yeah.
Thank you.
As to whether poverty is a feminist issue, it is, but I'm not necessarily the best place to argue that.
Thanks, Russell. We'll move on to take one or two more answers, and then I'll be passing over to Mark Cooper to wrap up the panel for us. Shavanah.
Thanks. So I think that, we've got some of the right foundations in Wales, in that we have had the groundbreaking law already in place with the Few Generations Act, and we have enacted the socio-economic duty. And of course, there's a social partnership and procurement bill that's upcoming as well. So in terms of the legislative side of things, that seems to be there, but now it is going to be about building back what that looks like, the jobs market, because we know that that's continued to discriminate against many women in particular. So we've got to manage that very carefully. So the Wales TUC have been calling for Wales's recovery to be driven by green infrastructure investment. So particularly focusing on jobs that have usually been held by men. So we need to, put the right policies in place to make sure that any public investment is going to lead to good jobs, that there is access for unions, and that employers are working with us and with government to make sure that we've got a diverse pool of candidates, of course, as well, applying for the relevant training. And that as far as the recruitment practices are concerned, that they're fair and inclusive in the first place, because otherwise we're just going to end up rebuilding rebuilding an economy that isn't fair, that isn't equal, that continues to exploit labour and exclude people as well. So, as far as during the pandemic, of course, we know that it's been really difficult. It's been majority women who have been juggling work and homeschooling as well. And this is real bit of confusion at the moment about home working, because home working doesn't actually equate to flexible working. And we often end up just confusing the two. So we end up doing a disservice to so many women's experiences that we've seen over the last 12 months as well. So I think that there's a lot for us to learn. I think that women do deserve a feminist intersectional recovery, but it can only ever be achieved if women are actually at the negotiating table, and that we are there, both as leaders, as individuals, as trade unionists, because if we are going to build back more equally, and we're going to have that economy that delivers for the many after the pandemic, we've got to address those long-standing entrenched inequalities, and they are far and wide. So I think that the latest ONS figures, initially we thought that it was more women who were being hit by job cuts because of furlough and so forth, didn't actually support everyone in the best way possible. But that isn't necessarily the case according to the latest figures, but that still doesn't take away from the fact that we've got such long-standing inequality issues, and we just keep kind of dancing around these topics and we don't really address them. So we've got the policies, we've got the legislation, we now need to push to make that legislation work for us.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop there because we are slightly over and we need to keep to time. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you, diolch yn fawr, to all of our panelists. Thank you so much. They will continue to answer some of the questions that we didn't get around to in the chat, in the Q&A chat. And if I could pass over to Mark Hooper. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been really, really great to talk to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, panel. I got a squeaky chair, so if someone heard my chair squeaking, I'm sorry about that. I thought that was fascinating and sometimes disturbing as well. I just want to start. So Shav's last sentence: we have such long-standing poverty issues, and we're dancing around the solutions. I think really sets the tone for why this conversation is important. And I'm just going to run through, I wrote a lot on this, but you know, when Ellie's presentation set the scene, 61% of children in Wales are living on income that is below the minimum income standard. In a world where we've got enough, and Wales has got enough, that is something that we within the independence movement can no longer deem as acceptable. So we've got to try and find solutions to some of these issues, and some of the questions that came out as well. And I noticed in the chat that Nigel was saying his question wasn't answered fully, and I'm going to come on to it just briefly if I can. But I think Ellie set a tone that really should worry us. And as Shav said, you know, this has been going for a long time. I think the contribution as well, when Shav talked about how the intersectionality, and particularly how workers are really important to this, is also critical. And you know, I want to applaud the Wales TUC for engaging on the issue properly and prepared to come up with a convention that looks at the right constitutional framework that supports workers. And I think that's important. And I think those of us who support independence should engage in that, because I think that voice is a voice that needs to be heard. I'm just going to, Hilary's contribution I thought was showed that the political economy needs debating, because the economy as it's set at the moment is not benign. This is central to lots of the things that we're talking about. And even when we're asked the question, which Nigel did, about taxation, do we have the funds to be able to do what we want to do? What strikes me is that actually we need to clearly define what sort of an economy, what's our economy for, and what do we want it to be. And Ellie made reference to that in her answers to some of the questions as well. But you know, I think even those who normally say Wales, you know, we're too poor to be independent, have stopped saying some of that at the moment. A lot of them have, and recognise that we can afford to do things, but what do we want to do? And I think that there needs to be a reflection that actually the world as it's set and the economy it's set at the moment needs changing. So I think that was fascinating. I've left Russell's contribution to last, because I think that challenge that was set there is probably, you know, if there's a call to action of how we move these things forward, I think it was set within that challenge. And actually talking in isolation about poverty and without engaging properly with those people who are suffering the consequences of poverty and getting them to be able to engage with us shows that we've got to become much, much closer to our communities. And I think, you know, Russell, I don't think he minced his words about how this is an important time for us to work together to get there. And also, you know, recognizing that this is the point of challenge. You know, we're actually at a point where as the audience, as the movement has grown, we are going to have these competing demands for what's right. But if we want to, you know, if we don't want 61% of our children in poverty, this is the challenge that we've got to take on. So I think that was exceptional. I'm going to just finish on, so given that Nigel said his question wasn't answered effectively, I just want to say that we're going to try and touch on some of the taxation issues when we deal with currency a little bit later. So I do want to answer, but the answer is to make sure that we define the economy that we want in the first instance, and then start to say things. You then come to a conclusion that actually, taxing wealth effectively is something that could start to solve some of these problems. But I thought it was an exceptional debate. I've been trying to tweet out what's been going on. I probably missed a lot of it. I look forward to it when it's online in the future. And now I'm going to shut up and pass over to Caris again, who I believe is next on.
Thank you, Mark. Oh, it's lovely to see your face again. And also hello to Siôn Jobbins. Hyfryd bod ti'n gwylio heddi. Thank you all so much, all the panelists, Sarah and the panelists, for just a wonderful inclusive talk and debate, tackling difficult questions. I sometimes feel like, people can feel like they're on the fringes of these kind of debates. And nobody should be made to feel like that. So thank you so much to Sarah and the panelists for making the tone really accessible and inclusive, and of course to the organisers. So next we're going to have a lovely video by, Mark, can you mute yourself, darling? So next we're going to have a great video by Gavin Porter. It's a video that portrays people who elaborate on the independence. I hope you really enjoy it. They're fantastic. I've seen them. They really get to know the individual and what independence means for them. And it's shot so beautifully well as well. So yes, take it away.